Eric Leeper is the professor of Goodloe McIntyre Professor in Economics at the University of Virginia, a position he began in 2018. He's also a research associate at the prestigious National Bureau of Economic Research, director of the Virginia Center for Economic Policy at the University of Virginia, and a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. He's a former Rudy Professor at Indiana University, external advisor to the Swedish Central Bank, and member of the Research Council of the Bundesbank. So the research of Professor Leeper focuses on the interaction on the theoretical and empirical model of macroeconomic policy, with special emphasis on monetary fiscal policy interaction. So in fact, he's one of the fathers of this field, and we are so happy to have him. So there are two lines of research. One of the oldest is the work that focuses on the new mechanism called the fiscal theory of the price level. By that mechanism, fiscal policy can influence economic activity and inflation. Recent research examines the economic impact of government spending, the macroeconomic consequences of alternative resolution of long-term fiscal imbalances, and the modeling of the fiscal limit and sovereign risk. So I'm very happy to let him now to deliver us his lecture. And just the last word is that during this lecture, we will very much interaction. And Professor Leeper, welcome interaction, ask question, raise your hand, and we'll be happy to let you speak because he really, I think, encourage learning and dynamic and active learning. And maybe also would like to have you showing your webcam so that we can see the face. And I would like to make a first test. So all the people now in the room, can you turn on your camera so that also we can make this event historical by taking the picture? Let's see whether it's going to work. It's going to work, it's working, yes. Okay, I see some faces. Hilton, Vincent, yeah. Luciana, okay. Good, I think it's almost 100% of the people we have. So now I'm going to leave politely the floor to Eric to deliver his lecture. The floor is for you, Eric.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time zone you happen to be in. I think it's fitting that we have representation from so many different time zones because this is a topic, monetary and fiscal interactions, that has suddenly become of great interest worldwide. And I'm happy to see that, of course, but what I'm going to try to do today is introduce this at a couple of different levels, theoretically, and then talk a little bit about some of the empirical aspects. And I have far too many slides to talk about. My philosophy of teaching is always that it's better to go deep than to go broad. And so I'm going to rely on feedback from you all to know whether the pace that I'm going at is good. So please ask questions. It is important to get things clarified early on because I think in this area, there happen to be quite a few misperceptions or preconceived notions. And I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So having said that, I am going to be sort of skipping through parts of these slides. The rest are there for your reference. I guess we'll get going. Okay, so let's start by asking why even think about policy interactions. Well, I think the answer is pretty obvious during extreme times like now or the financial crisis, because you want to bring all your policy guns to the fight. Monetary policy in many countries drove the interest rate down to the effective lower bound. Central banks engaged in large-scale asset purchases, huge expansions in their balance sheets. At the same time, fiscal authorities passed a lot of emergency spending and transfer programs to deal with the crisis at hand. And during those periods, you kind of worry about the long run implications later. I'm not saying that's necessarily good policy, but that is the reality. Now, these kinds of interactions where monetary and fiscal policy sort of jointly move to address a specific issue are the kinds of interactions that can be turned on or off. I consider these to be kind of optional. But, you know, the thing is that in normal times, policy interactions don't disappear. Basic economic reasoning requires that policies be consistent. And normally, if we're thinking about formal models, consistency is a long-run notion. But in an environment where policies cannot commit to future actions, where individual decision makers are forward-looking, these long-run ideas can have short-run bite. Now, these kinds of interactions cannot be turned off. They are ubiquitous. So at some fundamental level, monetary and fiscal policies can never be independent. Okay, so let me make a couple of general points about inflation. And I think everyone understands these points, but I'm going to put them in language that kind of conjures up the policy interactions from the beginning. So inflation arises whenever the government prints more currency than it absorbs in taxes. When you've got more currency, you know, it's this hot potato idea that Friedman talked about. People try to get rid of this currency by buying things, and this pushes up wages and prices. Now, the government can soak up currency by selling bonds, and it does this anytime it spends more than it taxes. But nominal bonds, like fiat currency, are just promises to pay more currency in the future. And if the government doesn't soak up the bonds with taxes, you're going to get inflation. So already we're trying to establish a type of symmetry between money, currency, which we think of as being under control of the central bank, and bonds, which we think of as being under the control of the fiscal authority. Now, monetary policy, this is going to sound controversial, gets its power from fiscal backing. And I'm going to go into that in quite a bit of detail. Now, when that fiscal backing is assured, then monetary policy operates exactly as our textbooks say. The central bank can control inflation, higher interest rates done through, say, open market sales of bonds, reduce consumption and inflation. But the critical element, the dirty little secret here, is this is only true if future taxes soak up the bonds that were pumped in to raise the interest rate in the first place. And the reason is that these higher taxes eliminate the wealth effects of higher interest payments on government debt. So the critical sort of link here between monetary actions and fiscal policy comes from the wealth effects of monetary policy. I see there's a question. Oh.
It was just a comment about the recording. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I don't have to address that one.
No, completely no.
Okay. Now, if these higher taxes aren't forthcoming or people don't expect them to be, then these higher interest rates are going to raise wealth, reduce the value of bonds, which then induces people to substitute out of bonds and into buying goods, increasing aggregate demand and inflation. So it's all about fiscal backing, the effects of monetary policy. Now, this is going to be especially relevant for smaller economies. There is a really crucial distinction between real and nominal debt. Okay, real debt we want to think about as being denominated in units of goods. In other words, they're a promise to goods, not just a promise to currency. And this arises whenever debt is in units whose quantity the government cannot control. So take Belgium as an example. Belgium issues euro-denominated bonds, but because the Belgian fiscal authority or Belgian government does not control monetary policy, to Belgium, these euro-denominated bonds are real debt. It can also happen if debt is indexed to inflation or is issued in foreign currency, or in the days when we were on the gold standard, government debt was all real. Now, in a lot of countries today, only a small fraction of debt is real. But the critical point here is that this real debt is a claim to goods, okay? In order for governments to acquire those goods, they have to raise taxes or use money creation. In other words, they have to be able to extract real resources from the private sector. If it can't acquire those goods, then you're Greece, and the only option is to default. Now, nominal debt is very different. It's denominated in home currency. And so this occurs whenever the debt is in units whose supply the government can control. And in the United States, all but about 90% of treasuries are nominal. The rest are indexed. But even in some of the Latin American countries, a sizable percentage of the debt that they issue is in home currency.
So, there is a question,
yes, sir.
There was a question by Hilton. He wanted to understand on slide 2 when you phrase fundamental, do you mean the policy regime and decision, endogenous and zero, or the control government balance sheet, or both?
By fundamental. Ooh. Somebody's paying attention. This is
very interesting.
Let me make sure I know what's being asked.
Hilton, can you put also your camera on so that we have more interactive exchange? Because you raised that question.
Yeah, I don't on slide 2.
Yeah.
I don't really see the word fundamental.
Hi, Eric. You said at a fundamental level. And
oh,
then,
yeah. Okay. Here.
And then yes. And then I wanted to know whether or not you were, I mean, I have a feeling you're talking about the consolidated balance sheet, but are you also talking about the regimes and policy decisions that are made? So is it both or either or that you mean when you say at a fundamental level?
No, it's all of the above. So if you want to think about policy regimes, monetary and fiscal policy need to be obeying rules that are consistent with the existence of an equilibrium. That is going to put restrictions on what range of policy rules can be adopted. And so in that sense, they can't be fully independent. Okay. And I'm going to be a lot more precise about what I mean by that. Okay. So going back to nominal debt, the critical thing is that if a government issues nominal debt, then on the margin, and this is a really important distinction that gets missed, there's really a difference between what is the average source of financing and what is the marginal source of financing. And so on the margin, and we can think of that as in response to shocks that are hitting the economy, surprise changes in the in surpluses or something. On the margin, the government has a choice about when it's got nominal debt about whether to finance that with higher taxes or by just printing currency. And as we're going to see, this distinction carries important policy implications. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do in this first part is establish at an intuitive level what I mean by consistent policies. And do not take offense at the level at which I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to reduce it to supply and demand. And I think in some ways that's more transparent than writing down a bunch of difference equations. But don't worry, we'll get to some difference equations for those of you who have a hunger for such things. And so that's when we talk about the more formal model, and I'll introduce policy rules, and then we get into talking about regimes. I would like to talk about some data. One example of that is what I think are examples of inconsistent policies, which Europe pre-COVID was following. And then an example of consistent policies that were actually quite effective, which was what sort of triggered America's recovery from the Great Depression. And then time permitting, we'll talk about broader stuff. So I'm going to stay in very, very simple models here. And you should understand that all of this stuff generalizes to much broader models. So what do I mean by consistent policies? Well, let's start by thinking about a representative household that receives goods, Y, every period. And that household chooses consumption and then chooses what portfolio to hold its savings in, either money or bonds. And then, of course, like all good governments, it has to pay its taxes. So this household's going to maximize utility subject to this flow budget constraint. And here I'm just assuming 1 period bonds, sell at price Q. Was there a question? Okay. But we could instead write it in terms of the intertemporal budget constraint that the household faces. And there's a reason for me doing this. So let's just interpret this intertemporal budget constraint. So what we have on the right-hand side is this is the expected present value of after-tax income. This baby here is the value of its initial financial wealth. So at the beginning of period T, it has these bonds. You divide those by the price level and you get what the real value of that wealth is. And then it uses that income and that wealth to buy consumption goods and increments on its money holdings. Okay, so I just repeat that budget constraint. If we define the primary surplus as taxes less government spending plus seigniorage revenue, so this is a non-standard definition of the surplus, and we could do all this in a cashless environment if you like, but I prefer to put money in. And then we clear the goods market, so that's just demand for goods by consumers and the government equals supply. Then what we get is the value of this initial wealth. And that value is the expected present value of these primary surpluses. So this is intended to establish that two things. One is bonds derive their value from expected future discounted surpluses. So you should immediately think, oh, wait. So this S variable is something that governments can control. This discount factor, well, they can influence, it's not a choice variable typically. But policy is going to impinge on both components of this present value. That's point one. Point two is I mentioned something about wealth effects initially when I talked about monetary and fiscal policy jointly, and this is where they're coming from. So these are the wealth effects that are impacting the behavior of private agents through their intertemporal budget constraint. All right. Now, if we use that expression back in the flow budget constraint, we get a demand for bonds. And what we see here, this is the demand for nominal bonds. It is homogeneous of degree 1 in the price level because they don't care about nominal stuff, right? They care about real stuff. It's going to depend inversely on the price of bonds. And then it's going to be increasing in the backing of those bonds. Okay. So the value of these bonds is going to be driven in large part by what's happening to the present value of expected surpluses. When those are high, then there's more real backing for bonds. Bonds become more valuable, more desirable. Okay.
Can I ask something? So this price effect of bond holding, I was wondering whether it fully accounts for the fact that holding bond may also generate additional, I don't know, happiness, utility, or here, for instance, think about even an open economy where some foreign central bank, they want to hold some bond for other, I don't know, objective. Is it fully incorporated in this analysis here? And of course, if it is not, it may also have implication for this policy interaction.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. In principle, that would all get reflected in the price of that bond. But in practice, I'm not so sure whether that's true. Mm-hmm. And this is particularly relevant when interpreting, say, US data during these crises when there's a flight to quality.
Yes.
And that has been a really central element in both of these crises. Mm-hmm. I'm just trying to keep this as simple as possible, though.
Okay. Yeah. Mm.
So then you append to that a very conventional looking demand for money. So we have demand for both kinds of assets by the private sector. Okay. Now, you normally don't see a demand for bonds in our models. It just is, quote, the residual. Mm-hmm. But I'm being explicit that there is this demand for bonds for a reason.
Yeah.
So what you will notice is there's a price level in both of these demand functions. Well, there can only be one equilibrium price level. So what that says is that consistent policies have to deliver a price level that clears both the bond market and the money market. That is one way to think about what I mean by consistent policies. Mm-hmm. Now, you can do all of this with interest rate rules instead of treating the money stock as the monetary instrument, and I will do that in a second. But I think this makes it really clear. And then on top of that, of course, you better make sure that fiscal policy is sustainable, that government debt is stable, or it doesn't grow too fast.
Nicolas has a question. Yeah.
Ask a question, because here you have two prices. You have the prices and the price of the bond. Mm-hmm. For which one, how do they interact in some sense? Maybe you will get there later, but how do you interact? Because you can have an equilibrium just because the price of the bond changing, but doesn't affect the price.
Yeah, no, and you'll see that in a second, I think.
Okay.
And in a fully fleshed model, you'll see exactly the answer to that. Okay, so now what this allows us to do then is boil down this consistency idea to just supply and demand analysis. And that's what I've drawn here. I have the bond market and the money market. I put the price level on the axis because that ensures, like all good demand functions, that these are upward sloping. And what this is saying, that was a joke, by the way. And what this is saying is that the P that is consistent with equilibrium in the bond market better be the same P that's consistent with equilibrium in the money market. Now, Nicola's point is, well, that's also true of the Qs. And that's right. Obviously, you know, we don't get to just pick which variables are consistent. But I want to focus on the P just so that we see very concretely what's going on. Okay. So we can imagine here that the price of bonds are just pegged. Say you're at the effective lower bound and the nominal interest rate is fixed. And then I don't think there's any ambiguity here. But what this implies is that if a shock hits one market and it requires a change in P, then you better get some adjustment in the other market. That is policy interactions. Okay? And this is not something that you can turn on or off. This is the definition of an equilibrium. And so if we're going to think about an equilibrium, then anything that perturbs the price level in one market requires some adjustment in the other market. And when we get into talking about policy regimes, what we're basically doing is we're saying where those adjustments are coming from. We're taking a stand on that. Okay. Now, typically, as I alluded, if you look at like the canonical New Keynesian model, I'm picking that as an example because everyone, I think, is familiar with it. There isn't any discussion about the demand for bonds. And the reason is that we just invoke Walras law, right? We say, okay, we cleared the goods market and the money market. Therefore, the last market, the bond market, clears. Okay. But what we're doing there is we're making a specific and very strong assumption about fiscal behavior when we say that. And in particular, we're in a world that's just purely Ricardian. So you get a bond finance tax cut, and that's what I've illustrated here. The supply of bonds shifts out. If there were no shift in demand, that would tend to drive the price level up. So what do we assume? We assume that the expected present value of surpluses rises by exactly enough to shift the demand curve and allow this initial price level to still be the equilibrium. That is a very strong assumption. But it is telling you how these interactions, what that is doing basically is it's making sure that nothing has to adjust in the money market, right? So it's self-contained, everything happens in the bond market, and then we don't have to worry about the bond market. All right? Okay. So if we think about what consistent policies means in terms of wealth effects, then let's think about there being a monetary expansion that raises the price level. Well, that bondholder has this initial bonds BT minus 1. If the price level goes up, then that bondholder's wealth falls. Okay. If there were no expected change in surpluses, then that household is less wealthy. It's going to reduce its demand for goods, which is going to tend to bring the price level down, right? It counters what monetary policy is trying to do. So if fiscal policy refuses to validate this higher price level that the central bank desires, monetary policy's desires are going to be thwarted. Now, fiscal policy can offset these negative wealth effects. So what's happening is monetary policy is generating a negative wealth effect, right? Monetary expansion is reducing the real value of the household's nominal assets. And fiscal policy can back monetary policy by just reducing future surpluses. So that means that then what happens is fiscal policy is generating a positive wealth effect. When those exactly offset, all that you're left with is the intertemporal substitution effect of monetary policy. Wealth effects disappear. That is the canonical New Keynesian thought experiment. Okay? And this is what is sometimes called passive fiscal policy. So these countervailing wealth effects end up coming down to the question, how much does the expected present value of surpluses respond to monetary policy actions? And in the standard New Keynesian model, it responds exactly in just the right way. So these positive and negative wealth effects just cancel out. Okay? So now what I want to do, so that establishes, and maybe if anybody has any questions, we should address them before we go on, because I'm now going to move into a more formal model with rules.
I have a question. Hi, Eric. I have a question from Anthony on the chat. That is asking if at which level we can assume that the government has got full control of the present value of expected surpluses, when many variables that determine these expected surpluses are outside the control of government. Typical,
yeah, no, I mean, that's,
countries that rely on commodity revenues, or even South Africa, in which a lot of the budget is sensitive to that, will be the fluctuation of the price of commodity that affect directly the expected surplus.
Right. No, I think that's an excellent question. And if you add on to that the fact that that governments can't pre-commit, so even if they talk a good line about we're going to do this, there's a lack of credibility. So that raises, I think it should raise in your minds, well, then why do we always do this fiscal response to monetary policy in our models? Which is exactly the question I want to raise in your minds. And maybe go the next step and say, and what happens if it's not there? And that's what I want to, that I think is front and center as a question to explore. And I will try to apply that to Europe when we get to it.
There is also a question, someone, Mamokete, would like to ask something?
Yeah, I'm just looking at this model and it's quite intriguing. I'm just wondering if it's possible then to use this monetary policy, fiscal policy interaction for wealth distributive effects. So you lower the wealth of savers who are ostensibly in the bond market, and you pass it on to consumers. Would that be the sort of way in which this works out?
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because we're working here with a representative agent. And so in a representative agent, it all seems very clear. So that's how we eliminate wealth effects. But now imagine that you have heterogeneity. Now these tax transfer schemes that will exactly eliminate wealth effects become very complicated. And the more heterogeneity you have, the more complicated those schemes become. And so you're exactly right that once you're in an environment with more than one kind of agent, this will have distributional consequences. And that's something that the heterogeneous agent literature is slowly coming to terms with, that what is really driving things is fiscal assumptions rather than monetary policy. So if you look at the paper that most people know, which is the Hank model, monetary policy according to Hank, I'm in the process of working on a paper. The only contribution I've made so far is the title, which is Monetary is Fiscal Policy According to Hank. And it's exactly the point that you just made. Okay, so now let's move on to a more formal setting. Most of what I'm going to do here is completely standard, and so I don't think we have to go, we can pick up the pace a little bit probably. So it's going to be another endowment economy, but now we're going to go cashless because that allows us to simplify some of the expressions. We have complete financial markets, one period nominal bonds. So the household just maximizes utility subject to this flow budget constraint, which I've written in nominal terms, but is otherwise very much like what we just looked at. So the nominal interest rate, which is going to become the monetary policy instrument here, is just going to be the inverse of this expected bond price. Okay, so again, we can write down this household's intertemporal constraint. And now the formalism here is what allows you to kind of write this intertemporal constraint the way that I did before is you invoke this transversality condition, which just says that at an optimal choice, the household's not going to want to over or under accumulate assets. Okay, I glossed over that before, but this is what puts restrictions on how rapidly government debt can grow. So it's not that debt can't grow, it's just that it can't grow too fast. Okay, so if we impose equilibrium, we end up, this model just boils down to two equations. The Fisher equation, so now we have constant real interest rates. And so we've got a Fisher equation, and then we have this bond valuation equation, which we saw before. The difference now is because we've got constant real rates, we just have a beta here instead of that, that discount factor. Now, to sort of rehash what we did before, we said, okay, we've got to find a price sequence that is consistent with clearing the bond market and the money market. The way that shows up once you're in this cashless environment is you've got to find a price sequence that is consistent with clearing the bond market, which is basically this equation, and it's got to be consistent with this Fisher equation. Okay, so now if you don't make any additional restrictions like on policy behavior, then there are going to be many possible price sequences. So that motivates us to posit some policy rules. So 1 over P here is the goods price of a nominal bond, okay, because that's the only asset. And 1 over R is the dollar price of that bond. So we're gonna, this is gonna look like a Taylor rule if you're standing on your head. You just make the nominal interest rate respond to inflation or deviations of inflation from target. And fiscal policy sets the surplus as a function of deviations of, this is the market value of debt from some target level, okay? And then we've got 2 exogenous shocks, one to monetary and one to fiscal policy. Okay, so we're just gonna reduce this. We're gonna define the inverse of inflation. We're gonna write little b as real debt. And you combine the policy, all I'm doing here is combining the policy rules with the Fisher equation and the flow budget identity for the government. And as we say in Virginia, voila. We get 2 difference equations that completely summarize the model, okay? The first, you should remember, this nu is the inverse of inflation, so it's just a difference equation in inflation. And the second is a difference equation in debt. Now, if you just look at this equation, you think, okay, alpha, well, that's a parameter of monetary behavior, right? The shock, epsilon m, is a monetary shock. You look at that and you think, okay, inflation must be completely a monetary phenomenon. If you shift to debt, you see, okay, gamma, well, that's the coefficient in the fiscal rule. Epsilon f is the coefficient, is the shock to fiscal policy. Now it looks like, gosh, debt stabilization is just a fiscal thing. So it's very tempting to look at these and think that, well, there aren't really interactions of policy. And so what that means is that these interactions are all going to come from what's happening in equilibrium. Okay. And what you want to remember is that what we have up here is PT over PT plus 1. This B is big B over PT plus 1. So it's the price level that appears in these two things. This gets back to why the fact that this is nominal debt is so important. If this were real debt, then this second difference equation would not involve a price level. And you would have shut down policy interactions. So the policy interactions are arising from the impact that monetary policy has on the price level and vice versa, that fiscal policy can have on the price level to which monetary policy reacts. Okay? So keep in mind what the definitions of these variables are. So now we get into these policy regimes. And the first one is like a Taylor regime. That's one where the interest rate reacts strongly to inflation and surpluses react strongly enough to debt to stabilize debt. Okay. The second one is really the fiscal theory world. And that's where the response of interest rates to inflation is weak and the response of surpluses to debt is weak. Okay. And in equilibrium, in either of these two regimes, there's going to exist a unique rational expectations equilibrium. And that means that you get a unique inflation process and you've stabilized debt so it satisfies that transversality condition. Okay. And of course, you've cleared markets and stuff. Okay. So this kind of emphasizes these two tasks of policy. And of course, when I say this to people who are in the policy world, they think, we do a few more things than that. But if you don't do these two things, you can't do much else. Okay. So one is you better determine the price level. You got to control inflation. And the second is you got to stabilize debt. Governments that can't manage those two things can't do other things either. So those are sort of necessary conditions. And the point here is that there are two different mixes of monetary and fiscal policy that can accomplish both of these tasks. So the first one, as I said, is the sort of conventional one. Monetary policy targets inflation, fiscal policy stabilizes debt. This is sometimes called active monetary, passive fiscal. And the second, those assignments get reversed. In the second one, it's actually monetary policy that's stabilizing debt and fiscal policy controls inflation. Okay, so the new Keynesian model, if you look at Jordi Gali's book or Mike Woodford, it's all about this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So can I ask something? In the regime F, is it a regime where you kind of have sort of, I will not say, like the fiscal maybe dominant starts, and then the central bank shifting. I would just would like to see the process through which the equilibrium realize. Do we have any thinking about that? So why does the monetary authority, they will stabilize the value of debt? Why do they ever do this? Is because they anticipate? That's my question.
Yeah, it's not that, and we're going to get into this, you'll see this.
Yeah.
It's not that the central bank is consciously choosing to stabilize debt. It is that its choice of an alpha that is small ends up stabilizing debt.
Okay.
And so one place where this would come up is if the central bank is at the effective lower bound. And you know, then it's no longer reacting strongly
to inflation.
Changes in inflation. So alpha is small, and boom, you're in that world.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. There was a question also by Anthony. He said, I would imagine that the extent of investor buy or bond confidence in fiscal assumption is a function of quality of fiscal. Said information asymmetry, which determine whether or not the initial negative monetary wealth effect is restored by fiscal policy.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tricky matter. It goes back to the point that was raised before, I think, about this present value of surpluses is going to get moved around by a lot of different factors in the economy, not just policy choice.
Right.
We will get back to talking about this in the second half with the empirical stuff, but basically the idea here, I'll speak only about the U.S. In the U.S., it goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, that where he said, we will honor our debt obligations. Now, there's no law that says that. So a lot of this comes down to kind of what are social norms, which is partly why the previous 4 years here were so disruptive. I mean, you had a president who said, I'm going to go into the bond market and negotiate new prices for the debt. I mean, that's kind of not going with the social norms. And so where a lot of this, a lot of these expectations get anchored is by having a history that if you've run deficits and debt has gone up, that it happens because people believe that you will eventually raise surpluses.
Okay.
But yeah, this issue of investor confidence is really important. And that's why this can be kind of a fragile thing. This is why the pronouncements by the modern monetary theory people are a bit scary, because they don't seem to understand this point that credibility and trust in government debt can be a fragile thing. And it's hard to get, it's very easy to lose. But I think that's addressing the question. Okay, so let me just quickly go through the solution. So in the case of regime M, there's a unique bounded solution, and this looks exactly like what you would get in any new Keynesian model. Now it turns out that in equilibrium, inflation seems to only depend on monetary stuff. Okay. So fiscal policy doesn't seem to matter for equilibrium inflation. Emphasis on the equilibrium. Okay. And so it looks like it gives you Milton Friedman's famous statement that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So then the question becomes, what is fiscal policy doing in this world? And I've already hinted at that, but we can see it more formally. So passive fiscal behavior is providing this backing, okay? And the backing is such that the response of the surplus to debt is more than the real interest rate. So what does that say? That says that if debt goes up by a unit, surpluses are going to go up by enough to finance it, plus a little bit, which will then retire it back to steady state. So let's just take an IID monetary shock. So that raises the price level if it's an expansion. That reduces the value of outstanding debt. Okay. If surpluses were unchanged, then that reduced real debt would just get passed into lower nominal debt growth just through the government budget identity. And eventually people would see that their wealth has declined. They would then reduce their demand for goods. That offsets this effect of monetary policy on the price level. Now, if on the other hand, this lower debt is backed by lower surpluses, so what we're saying here is monetary expansion leads to fiscal expansion. So to just put it in simple, memorable terms, well, then you get rid of this negative wealth effect, okay? And that is the definition of passive fiscal policy. What is happening is this increase in the price level gets validated by looser fiscal policy in the future. Okay? So we really need to extend Friedman's adage to say inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, so long as fiscal policy eliminates the wealth effects. Not nearly as catchy, but a bit more accurate. And Jim Tobin actually put his finger on this a long time ago. He said, you know, Ricardian equivalence is fundamental, perhaps indispensable to monetarism. So he understood that. He talked about these gremlins coming in and putting money in people's wallets, and whether they leave IOUs that say, oh, there are going to be changes in tax obligations in the future. And that's what he meant, that with Ricardian equivalence, all of that gets wiped away. Now, of course, in this environment, nothing interesting happens when you cut taxes because it's just purely Ricardian. So I don't need to go into that. So what fiscal policy is doing here is it's actually doing two things. And I would say it's doing a lot of the heavy lifting. First, it's stabilizing debt. That part of fiscal policy, governments understand completely. In fact, some governments seem to think that's the only role for fiscal policy. But the second one is providing backing to monetary policy. That's a second component. And this is the part that I think has been overlooked by countries that have been adopting fiscal rules. The fiscal rules have been geared toward stabilizing debt, not toward giving the backing to monetary policy that is needed.
There are two questions. One question was simple. Does the monetary, no, there was a question, is this model determine the price level or inflation? That was a question by Hilton, based on your slide 18.
Okay.
And another question say, how would the COVID fiscal expansion be explained by the fiscal rule only responding to debt deviation from target?
Okay.
While the collapse in activity requires counter-cyclical fiscal policy via large fiscal deficit.
Okay, let me answer Hilton's question first.
Yeah.
In regime M, if you're, this is going to get a little technical, but I think he can handle it, or he wouldn't be asking this question in the first place. in regime M, if you're in discrete time, then it looks as though it's just inflation that's getting determined uniquely, not the price level. But as you go to continuous time, it becomes clear that it's the price level. So that distinction, I'm willing to kind of wave my hands about. Mm-hmm. In regime F, what you will see is it's explicitly the price level, and therefore it's also the inflation rate. Now, the second question.
Yeah, it was about the COVID. How will the
Okay.
COVID fiscal expansion be explained by the fiscal rule, only responding to debt deviation from target, while the collapse in real activity require counter-fiscal fiscal policy via like fiscal deficit?
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's clear that this particular rule has not been in operation.
Mm-hmm.
But let me point something out. I'll go back to the financial crisis. After the big stimulus package was passed in 2009, I think,
Mm-hmm.
President Obama, within a week of passage of that bill, pledged to reduce deficits by 50% by the end of his first term. Now, and he actually stabilized debt. So I think that the rule, the way we write it down is far too mechanical to reflect actual behavior. But I think that's a great example where almost in real time, you had the president reassuring people that we're going to be taxing you and cutting spending in the future. Now, the way it actually operates is at a lower frequency. So what seems to happen in the United States, and this is partly why we're not seeing it now, is once debt service gets to be a big fraction of expenditures, politicians they feel the bite, right? Because suddenly they have to pay interest on debt. They can't hand out money to their constituents. That's when fiscal reforms take place. And if you look in the post-war US period, you can pretty closely align fiscal reforms with instances where that ratio got very high. Right now, even though debt has been growing rapidly, debt service has not. And so there's no political pressure to have that happen, right? Now, in defense of the model, what we've done is we've written down a really simple rule that makes it look like these reactions are very quick. But remember that what really matters is this expected present value of surpluses. And in a model of this simplicity, it doesn't matter whether these surpluses adjust next year or 50 years from now. Of course, 50 years from now, they'll have to adjust more. But to the individual, that's a matter of indifference. So, so I don't think that we're losing kind of any essence, any real key point here by the simplicity of the fiscal rule. Of course, if we were to go to data, that would be a different matter. Okay, but for the logic of what we're getting at, I don't think it's a big deal.
Okay. There is maybe a quick question from Mokete, please.
Yeah, so I just want to get a sense of whether I'm understanding you correctly. So would you then say, in a simplistic way, what you're doing here is you're saying, well, you've got two choices. You've got a certain stock of wealth that you're going to acquire over multiple years that is assumed somewhere, and you can either choose to pull that wealth forward or to push it out. And basically the relationship between fiscal and monetary policy is basically transferring expenditure from the future to the past and back and forward in that way. But on a net basis, wealth is almost like a stock that is somewhat consistent in current economic agents' minds. Would that be a characterization of this model?
In regime M.
Yes, in regime M.
In regime F, life is different. But in regime M, I think, yeah, and what you're really describing is in actually a really nice way that I hadn't thought about is really what Ricardian equivalence is all about. The Ricardian equivalence, don't underestimate the power of that. It is imperialistic. It dominates these models. And so, and it's doing exactly what you just said, that you get this, the question is your wealth going to change? And well, you know, you can get more bennies from the government today, but then the government's going to take bennies away from you tomorrow. So your wealth doesn't change.
But also in essentially what you're basically also, you know, saying in both regimes actually is that the two parts of policy, monetary and fiscal, sorry, they fall together or rise together. But essentially, I'm trying to think in my head, is there a situation where you can maintain some sort of monetary policy credibility if you don't have fiscal policy credibility, and the reverse? Or do they need each other to be functioning for the whole, you know, for the whole, I don't know, what's the word I'm looking for, the policy, the policy dispensation to actually hold?
Yeah, I would, that was kind of the essence of my little provocative sentence, that they can never really be independent. That at some, now again, in our models, you know, these are infinite horizons, and, you know, there's a lot of stuff that can happen in the future that makes everything hang together. In reality, I think people want to see things happen right away, or not, if not right away, they want to be assured they're going to happen. You can't just push things off indefinitely. So the consistency that I'm talking about, I think in practical terms, needs to be something that individuals are seeing on an ongoing basis. You can't simply say, yeah, don't worry, we're going to do all this later on. So it's really about how should you be designing your monetary fiscal regime. And I think part of the problem has been that the mentality, especially among inflation targeters, has been, not everywhere, but in most countries, has been, okay, we're going to get monetary policy into good shape. And I guess just pray that fiscal policy will fall into line. You know, there are very few countries that actually undertook both monetary and fiscal reforms simultaneously. And so that's where I would want to put my attention if I were thinking about policy, that you need to design the monetary and fiscal institutions from the get-go so that they will deliver consistent policies. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Or did I successfully dodge it? That's all I want to know.
No, you didn't. I'm happy.
So I think we have about the time in there. I think how long you need to conclude that part before the break? We were planning the break in about 2 minutes. Do you think it's fine, or you want to finish something?
I'd like to at least talk about regime F if I could.
So go ahead then. Go ahead. Don't worry. I will see the way to manage later.
I'll talk really fast. Okay.
Okay.
So
sure.
let's think about regime F as regime F is a world where we have no response to surpluses to debt. So it can be responding. They can be responding to other things, right? Real economic activity, etc., inflation, but not debt. Okay, so you can then solve for the price level. And what you see here is that the price level depends on existing debt, and then it just depends on a bunch of fiscal stuff. So again, here now it looks like, oh, only fiscal policy matters for the price level. And here's where the wealth effects come in. So now what's going to happen is, if individuals get higher transfers today, and they don't expect any offsetting taxes in the future, then they're going to feel wealthier. And they're going to try to transform that wealth into consumption. And when they do that, that's going to drive the price level up. Okay. And so you can think about the demand for bonds as just the flip side of aggregate demand. Just like for those of you who, I say this to my grad students and they have no idea what I'm talking about. Those of you who know ISLM, you know, money demand is just the flip side of aggregate demand. Same thing for bond demand. Okay. So what ends up happening here is, and I'll just cut to the chase, is monetary policy, as I said, is going to be stabilizing debt. And the way that it stabilizes debt is by having the interest rate respond only weakly to inflation. If news arrives of lower surpluses, what happens is the price level jumps. That delivers stable debt. So another way to think about this is monetary policy is not raising interest rates very sharply with debt, and therefore debt service doesn't explode. That's another way to think about this. And I go through an example of this, and the main thing I want to show you is just after you've done the algebra, what you end up seeing is this monetary policy parameter shows up as being essential for delivering stability. And here you're seeing that the interest rate gets stabilized by a small value of alpha less than beta, which is the passive monetary policy. Okay. So, so that's kind of what I want to say here. The rest of this is just a bunch of algebra that goes through the details. Okay. So I guess what I'll do then is after our break, I'll pick up with talking about some data.
Okay. 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 Thanks a lot for this nice lecture. We are expecting the second part.
Maybe I can ask a question while we are waiting for the others. Because what was always, should we take it literally? These what happened when they are not consistent? So how you get to the consistent equilibrium? Therefore, if the two policies are not apart, probably you will have example European Union of this non-consistent policy. But how are the two when they are not consistent, when they are outside the equilibrium? That is the case for example, also South Africa, in a sense that we have a monetary policy, sort of traditional inflation targeting, and a fiscal policy that for a while has been, risking to be out of control. What are the implications in the model of non-consistent policies?
Well, see,
which one dominates in some sense? There is a domination of one on the other.
I think that one could start to think about this in game theoretic terms, but I've never found that to be terribly helpful. So I've done a bunch of work with Markov switching. So you can have periods where the policies are inconsistent, but then there's this expectation that you're going to become consistent eventually. I'm not happy with that answer. Because I think you end up having to make rather bold assumptions about transition probabilities and expectations of what policies will look like in the future that seem kind of implausible. And the problem, part of this is if you're going to stay in a rational expectations equilibrium, then that puts a lot of constraints on what you can do. So I think that we probably want to examine more, sort of learning environments where you don't have this same issue. So one of my good friends, Bruce Preston, has done a lot of work in that area. I think that, the level of information that we endow our agents with in rational expectations models is just completely implausible.
Yeah.
But, you know, it takes a model to beat a model. And so that's what we're stuck with. So yeah, the short answer is our models can't really answer that question.
Can I, sorry, it's Eric Schaling here. I'm also in South Africa. Can I just reiterate Nicola's point? So I think the game theoretic angle is quite important. Obviously, game theory 101 is Nash. But I think the Stackelberg equilibrium would be more interesting. So that monetary policy would take the fiscal behavior into account.
Yeah.
And
no, we actually, I have a paper that is undergoing endless revisions where we've tried to do exactly that with, but taking the model to data. And we posit that the fiscal authority is a Stackelberg leader. And that seems to, the data seem to like that, but not that much, not when you assume that policy is optimal. So I think it's an open question, and I didn't mean to dismiss the game theoretic completely, but I think the bottom line is if you want to ever understand fiscal policy, you got to do political economy. And I am as guilty as every other macroeconomist in not bringing political economy fully into our models. When I think about U.S. policy, for example, I don't know how we can ever say anything without bringing those dynamics in. And I'd like to see more of that. And that may be more useful than the strategic. I'm not sure how strategic the behavior is, other than politically strategic.
okay. So another question I have is, what happens if you make this a finite horizon model, like say a 2-period model? Would that make any difference?
Actually, that's how I teach it to my undergrads. The big thing is that then instead of transversality, you just have to have that there's no debt in the final period. And so, no, everything goes through.
Okay, I propose we start again the lecture so that we can be on schedule about the objective. Yeah. Please, Erico.
Okay, so I think what I want to do is spend some time talking about data, because I think data is where some of this comes alive. And the first thing I want to start with is an example of what I think of as inconsistent policies. And here I'm speaking of Europe. And it's not just the Euro area countries, Sweden and Switzerland, I think fall into this category as well. So before COVID, the ECB and other central banks were just really massively expansionary. We had negative policy interest rates. I'm sure most of you are aware that we even had negative long-term nominal bond yields in several countries out 10, 20 years. There were big balance sheet expansions. And so these end up creating kind of negative monetary wealth effects. But inflation remains stubbornly below target. And the question is, well, why would that be? And lots of explanations have been offered, but none of them seem to think about the fiscal response. So I just want to show some data. So this is for the Euro area. The top graph is inflation, and then the blue line is the policy rate. Target is 2%. So there have been, extended periods where it was well below target. And this is after the financial crisis. And now it's again, well, not now, but in 2019, it was again below target. And what has been the fiscal stance? Well, even though interest payments have been declining, these governments have been moving toward larger primary surpluses. So that's telling you that there's a kind of weird fiscal rule in place. It's not passive fiscal behavior, because what we ought to be seeing is moving more toward fiscal ease during this period. Germany is an even clearer example, where you can see that there's been this massive decline in debt service. And with the exception of this 1 year, Germany's been running substantial primary surpluses. Similar patterns emerge in Sweden. Again, declining debt service. Oops, I didn't draw that very well. And movement toward primary surpluses. And I think it's because the mindset among most fiscal authorities is their job, aside from counter-cyclical policies and so forth, is debt stabilization. And so they haven't really been adopting these kinds of passive fiscal rules that provide the backing necessary for monetary policy. So I'm going to skip over this stuff. You guys can look at that in your leisure. And I want to talk about another example, which I think was successful. And here I'm going to go kind of quickly. This is based on a paper that I have with two co-authors. We're looking at the recovery from the Great Depression and the policies that Roosevelt adopted. And here what happened was, once he revoked convertibility from dollars to gold, he took what was real debt and made it genuinely nominal debt. Big regime change. Because now you've gone from issuing debt that had to be backed by future taxes to issuing debt that could be backed by printing dollars. And then what he did was he distinguished between the ordinary budget and the emergency budget. So you could think about this as countries issue COVID bonds, and they tell people the COVID bonds are not going to be backed by taxes. And, you know, that's exactly what he did with this emergency spending. He said, I'm going to run emergency deficits until the economy recovers, but I'm going to balance the ordinary budget. And he did a bunch of other things to try to persuade people that he was actually going to do this, because this was unprecedented. You know, it had 100 years on the gold standard where debt was always fully backed by future taxes, and he was doing something that bankers and lots of other people said was just crazy. So I'm going to skip over this, but basically the idea is we could model this as there being two kinds of spending, two kinds of debt. The ordinary spending is fully backed. The emergency spending is not. And I want to just get to some pictures. This is, I'm going to skip that too. You can look at that. Okay, here's what he did. So the red line is the primary surplus. The black line is the ordinary surplus. And you can see the difference here is emergency spending. So he really did essentially balance the ordinary budget, but he ran deficits on the emergency budget. Nominal debt more than doubled from 1933 to about 1940. So we have a doubling of nominal debt, all right? And it worked, even though his stated goal was to get the price level back to the level in the 20s, and he didn't get there because he got cold feet. We did see a rapid recovery that coincided with the departure from the gold standard. And here's the picture I want every policymaker in the world to see. Nominal debt more than doubled over this period. what do we see? Well, debt GNP ratio under Hoover rose quite dramatically. Roosevelt took over, boom, stable debt. Why? Well, the value of debt can rise only if people think that they're going to be future surpluses. And that's exactly what was happening during the Hoover period, because we were on the gold standard. That debt had to be backed by taxes. So that tells you that the gold standard was credible. But as soon as they left the gold standard, what happened was, you know, here we have B over P times Y, right? If P and Y move in line with B, the debt GNP ratio is flat. So there's no necessary conflict between fiscal stimulus and fiscal sustainability. The conflict arises if you're telling everybody, we're going to stimulate today, we're going to sell more bonds, but don't worry, we're going to tax you tomorrow to pay off those bonds. Then there's a conflict. But if you're telling people we're going to stimulate the economy and you have some clearly stated objective, you know, we're going to run these emergency deficits until the economy recovers, well, then there's no conflict with sustainability. And Roosevelt was under an enormous amount of pressure during this period, especially from bankers, because they said, oh, the US Treasury is going to lose its credibility. And what happened was he actually stabilized debt. So this is an example where I think we could have done something a little more coherent in funding COVID spending, because I think that qualifies as an emergency. And we could have said, look, we need to stimulate our economies, but we also need to finance this emergency spending. And what's going to happen is this debt that you issue is going to have much bigger kick. You get much bigger multipliers, as I'm about to show you, if it's not backed. Okay, so I want to turn, yes.
But the challenge is to try to consistently define these two types of fiscal policy. I mean, the ordinary and the crisis. And for politicians, how to make sure that the two are very, very well defined may be tricky, no?
Yeah, well, I think it could be tricky. But, you know, we've done things like that with war bonds and stuff like that. And so I don't think it's completely unprecedented. We do it when we issue index debt versus nominal debt. So, you know, we are able to put different labels on different kinds of debt. But I think communication is a critical element in this.
Yes.
And you really have to have that fiscal inflation is a slippery slope. I think isn't very well founded. You know, sure, we have lots of examples of hyperinflations that were driven by fiscal policy, but those are not what Roosevelt did, right? He did not say we're going to run printing presses to buy goods, and so I think that this is an example of something that we could do better on. We could be more coherent in thinking about how we want to finance different kinds of spending. Now, I think the irony here in the US is there's lots of detailed discussion going on about how to finance infrastructure, which is one of the few things that government does that probably has a positive return. Sorry, was I having connection problems?
No, I think it's another participant. I think Mr. Schilling microphone was on and create some noise sometime.
Charlie, yes.
Did you want to say something?
I have a question for you. This, the fact that these unbacked, I'll switch off my video. Maybe that works. Can you hear me?
Yeah, it was better.
Can you? Okay, all right. So Eric, my question is, do you need these unbacked fiscal expansions because you have Ricardian consumers, or is that not the case?
No, that's not. I'm actually going to talk about environments where Ricardian equivalence breaks down generically, and you still have a distinction between whether a marginal increase in debt is going to raise revenue in the future or not. So, you know, here the revenue would get raised by some distorting tax. So it's really about whether taxes in general are going to be adjusting.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a question, and it speaks to who the source of who the borrowers are, or the lenders in this case. So if you were borrowing in a currency that was other than yours, and the lenders were not necessarily you know, locals, they were foreign, what difference would it make in the sort of analysis?
Then you're a dead duck. No, I mean, once you issue in foreign currency, you've got to raise taxes.
So then it becomes necessarily backed.
Yeah.
In that instance.
Yes. Yeah, foreign currency debt is just like being on the gold standard or issuing index bonds. You know, there's a little bit of slippage through the exchange rate, but nothing you can count on.
Mm-hmm.
But what if you have, would it affect the demand for your bonds at all, for instance, or for your debt at all, for instance, if you are borrowing? So I don't quite understand what happened in the US, but I would imagine that the dollar depreciated quite precipitously at that time. So for instance, if I look at South Africa, where we borrow in domestic currency, but from international, if your currency was at risk, then you would probably lose that funding, right? Because then the value for the whole debt holders would depreciate because they're holding it in, they like dollar-based, for instance. So you might then not be able to borrow as much in your local currency, which forces you to borrow in foreign currency. So in essence, you're in the same quagmire, right?
Yeah, I'll confess something to you, because it's just you and me here talking, so nobody else can hear us. There are a lot of aspects of this theory that need to be worked out in the case of small open economies. There's been actually, most of this work has been done in closed economies. And so I'm hesitant to speculate on how far you can push this idea in the kind of environment that you're talking about. But there's I mean, it's a terrific avenue for research. But I just don't want to make claims that I think I can't really support. Okay, I apologize.
Yeah, thanks.
This is the curse of being an American. one of them.
So Eric, one thing you could do is to say that what you have is it talks about the global economy. So you could think of this as being the global economy, which you could decompose into different countries.
Yeah, except this issue of who controls the currency supply is critical, right? That's the problem in the monetary union, that Belgium doesn't control the ECB. So you really need to have control over the currency supply, or monetary policy more generally.